Welcome. Here, you can rest. Let your body grow heavy, your eyes soften, and your breath follow the slow rise of steam from warm water. Tonight, you'll hear the story of a woman no one noticed, and a house that slowly learned to breathe through her. Somewhere between the words, you may begin to dissolve too, until sleep finds you. The bathhouse stood where the alleys curved like rivers unsure of their path, half hidden behind shoji panels yellowed with age and soaked with old seasons. By day, the doors creaked open to courtesans and samurai, their footsteps echoing on wet wood. But by night, when the city exhaled and lanterns wept golden light onto puddles, a different presence moved within. Her name wasn't spoken, only whispered as a gust that passed under sliding doors and into the folds of damp cotton. She was the woman who scrubbed away sins left in the corners of porcelain tubs, long after everyone else had vanished. The air inside the bathhouse tasted of lye and lily root, smoke, and something vaguely metallic, like forgotten coins pressed against warm skin. The floor was always slick. You never knew if it was from steam, spilled tea, or something less polite. She moved barefoot, each step deliberate and quiet, her body wrapped in old linen too thin for winter, too soaked for modesty. It wasn't the water that cleansed, it was her hands, her gaze, the rituals she followed without needing to remember when they began. No one saw her arrive. No one saw her leave. At times, she would pause beside a basin where a scent lingered, a perfume too sweet, or the musk of someone who had loved too hard that evening. She never judged the water, only rinsed it. The cloth in her hand, worn but obedient, followed the curves of each bowl, each bamboo pipe, each polished floor tile with the same reverence monks gave to statues. She wasn't a servant, though they called her one, nor a ghost, though she moved like one. She was a witness to every moan muffled into towel, every drop of blood diluted by steam. Outside, Kyoto snored. The wind carried stories to rooftops and back down again. But inside, time melted like candle wax. The water, even in stillness, remembered everything. And in its silence, it trusted her. Only her. Because even porcelain has preferences. And in the late hours of this fragile city, she was the only one the bathhouse let in without hesitation. Some nights, she would look into the cloudy mirror that hung crooked in the staff corridor, not to see herself, but to glimpse the memories clinging to her silhouette. A flicker of a child once born in this very tub, a blush that didn't belong to her, a handprint fading slowly. The steam blurred everything except what mattered, and what mattered was that she stayed, long after the last towel dropped, long after the last sigh softened into sleep. The bath water was never just water. It was an archive of touch, of tension, of shame steeped like tea leaves. By law, the brothel's public ofuro had to be drained at dawn, yet no law ever reached the corners where she knelt. She would dip her hand into the tepid remnants, testing for what could not be seen, the trace of fever, the scent of rice wine or incense-stained sweat. She learned to know the women by the temperature they left behind. Some cooled quickly. Others burned the tub long after they'd gone. She didn't speak much, but she listened to what the water said. The women who bathed here often came in laughter, left in silence. The water held that silence like a secret too important to spill. She would drain it slowly, watching it spiral into the darkness beneath the boards, a gesture both intimate and final, like brushing hair from a dying face. There were nights the water resisted her. Nights it clung to the basin, reluctant to leave, as if it feared what came next. The rules of the bathhouse were clear during the day: no men after sunset, no women without coin, no entry if bleeding. But rules melted in steam, and she knew every exception. The night she first saw a geisha's tears dissolve into bubbles. The time a ronin came drunk and bathed fully clothed, whispering apologies to a lover long gone. The night when red bloomed in the tub, and she had to clean without asking. The water, again, said nothing, but it stained her sleeves for weeks. Sometimes she would add crushed camellia or orange peel to the final rinse, as if to apologize to the space itself. She'd press her palm against the tile walls, still warm, as if to comfort the bones beneath. The bathhouse groaned when no one else was there, not from age but memory. Wood warped with confessions, pipes moaned like aching throats. And she understood. Some structures are held together not by nails, but by secrets that demand silence. It was in this silence that she found her rhythm, a ritual not learned but absorbed. A choreography of cleansing, not of filth, but of memory. The bathhouse didn't need her, but it accepted her. And perhaps that was more sacred than any written prayer. Before she ever touched the bath water, she touched the towels. Dozens of them, each folded without care, slumped in woven baskets beneath the cedar shelves. They were never truly clean. No matter how much they were boiled, sun-dried, or beaten against stones in the river's belly, the cloths carried something more stubborn than stain. She would press one to her face, not to breathe it in, but to feel the weight of someone else's breath still trapped inside. The last exhale of a courtesan, the grunt of a hurried client, the sigh of someone who had no name. The scent was not unpleasant. It was thick, though, layered like lacquer on old wood. Camphor, sweat, powdered rice, blood diluted by rose water, smoke from hair oil. But deeper than all of these was the smell of the room itself, of steam risen and cooled again, of footsteps pressed into softness, of loneliness. She didn't wash the towels to remove their secrets. She handled them like scrolls. Unrolling one was like opening a memory. Folding it again was a kind of reverence. She often found long black hairs woven between the threads, or a bead of hardened perfume that clung to the edges like a dried tear. These things she never threw away. Instead, she collected them quietly in a lacquered box beneath the floorboards where she slept. No one knew of this ritual, not even the madam. It wasn't out of obsession or madness. It was something gentler, more instinctive, as if she believed that what a person left behind, in cloth or scent or residue, deserved to be remembered. There were nights when she laid one of those towels beside her futon and touched it with the back of her hand, gently, like greeting an old friend. Each towel had its own temperature, even in the dark. Some retained warmth longer than they should have, others felt strangely cold, as if soaked in sorrow rather than water. In her mind, they whispered names, not the names used in the brothel, but the ones no one spoke anymore. Childhood names, village names, names given in private and buried in silence. And it was in that silence that she began to understand her role not as a cleaner, but as a keeper. She wasn't erasing anything. She was cataloging the invisible. Not a servant of soap and towel, but a quiet archivist of bodies and their invisible histories. Her hands did not purify. They preserved. No one ever saw her shadow at night. This was not metaphor. There was something in the way the lantern light fell, something in the texture of her presence, that simply refused reflection. She would move across the wooden planks like a breath through reeds, her silhouette swallowed by the warm haze of steam and amber glow. The other women whispered about it, not out of fear, but out of a strange, tender awe. She was the only one among them who didn't cast herself onto the world around her, as if the bathhouse had chosen to keep her image for itself. They called her Kajiro, the heat shimmer, a name not truly hers, but fitting. She didn't correct them. A name is just a mask made of sound. She had worn many. Names given by grandmothers, names taken by men, names scribbled hastily on bathhouse ledgers. Kajiro was no better, but it was softer, and in its vagueness she found comfort, like mist that never commits to rain. When she passed through the garden corridor that separated the outer rooms from the inner chambers, the koi in the pond did not scatter. The bamboo leaves didn't tremble. Even the wind seemed to wait for her. She had become fluent in the architecture of stillness, not by choice, but by necessity. Once, long ago, she'd spoken too loudly, laughed too freely. That had cost her a home, or a mother, or something else too vital to name. Now she moved as if afraid to wake the ghosts that slept beneath the tatami mats. She'd often pause by the door of the steam chamber and listen before entering. Not for footsteps, those had long since ceased, but for echoes. Water remembers voices, even after silence returns. And in that pause, she'd feel a strange electricity on her skin, like standing near thunder without sound. She knew then which rooms to avoid, which bowls needed extra rinsing, which scent would soothe a restless tub. It was a conversation without language, and she understood every word. To those who watched, and there were many though none admitted it, she was less a woman than a phenomenon, a hush given form. The kind of presence that made you forget what you were thinking just a moment before. They wondered where she went when the sun rose, where she laid her body, what her voice sounded like when not muffled by water. But no one dared ask, because something in her absence felt sacred, and in that sacredness she remained untouched. There is a moment, just after midnight, when the heat inside the bathhouse begins to feel alive. Not aggressive, not consuming, but sentient. It rises from the floorboards in a slow inhale, wrapping around beams and paper panels like a lover rediscovering a familiar shape. The walls sweat, the windows blur. Even silence feels damp, heavier on the chest. And in that moment, Kajiro would pause at the threshold of the inner chamber and allow the heat to find her first. She never forced entry. The bathhouse responded only to those who waited. The steam in this hour no longer smelled like soap or citrus. It smelled like breath, human, forgotten, desperate breath, exhaled in pleasure or exhaustion or grief. The kind of breath that remains trapped between ribs long after the body has left the room. She would lift her sleeve to her mouth, not to shield herself, but to listen better. Scent is another kind of voice, after all, and she had trained her senses to interpret the unsaid. Here, a trace of cloves, a merchant from Osaka. There, a ghost of jasmine and charcoal, the girl with one eye blind, who never spoke, but always bathed twice. She would begin her work not with water, but with the floor. Kneeling low, cloth in hand, she would follow the grain of the wood, tracing lines that remembered footsteps. The floor was the first to be touched by those who entered and the last to feel their absence. Her palms moved in circular motions, as if coaxing stories from beneath the lacquer. And sometimes, when the room was utterly still, the boards would respond, with a groan, a whisper, a faint creak like a joint remembering motion. It was during these hours that the bathhouse truly opened to her. Hinges no longer resisted. Candles relit themselves with the memory of touch. Even the smallest puddle mirrored her face with clarity, as if saying, "Yes, you belong." She would test the bath temperature with her wrist, not by dipping, but by hovering. The heat would reach for her, a pulse, an invitation. And only then would she adjust the flame beneath the copper basin, feeding it with dried plum wood, slow and steady, like kindling a secret. There was no clock in the bathhouse, no chime or gong to mark the passage of time, only the rhythm of water cooling, warming, and cooling again. And within this rhythm, she found a strange kind of music, the hum of pipes, the drip of condensation, the whisper of cloth wrung over a basin. A music that no one else heard, and yet she danced to it. Softly, reverently, not with her feet, but with her breath. Because here, heat wasn't just warmth. It was memory reawakened, and she, its silent conductor. At the end of the hallway, near the unused servants' entrance, there hung a mirror, cracked at the edge, spotted with age, framed in wood that had once been red and was now the color of dried smoke. It was not meant for guests. No courtesan powdered her face there, no client checked his reflection before exiting. It was a forgotten thing, a remnant of an older bathhouse, older even than this one. And yet, every night, Kajiro stopped before it, not out of vanity, out of necessity. The mirror had no kindness. It did not flatter. It did not smooth wrinkles or warm tones. It showed her as she was, and more. Her outline was always slightly delayed, like the surface had to remember who she was before displaying her. When she moved, the reflection hesitated, and sometimes, on the coldest nights, the woman in the mirror did not move at all. She would simply stare back, still and calm, as if reminding Kajiro that the line between presence and absence is thinner than skin. She had tested it once. Lit a candle beside her, to see if the flame reflected true. It did, but not the same way. In the mirror, the flame leaned toward her. In life, it leaned away. After that, She never brought fire near the glass again. Some surfaces, she learned, were not made to reflect light. They were made to hold shadow. And shadow, like steam, is most revealing when left unspoken. When she stood before it, she did not look at her face. She watched the parts of her that others never saw, the small curve of her shoulder where hot water often clung, the scar below her rib from a long-forgotten burn, the tremble in her hands when a memory rose uninvited. The mirror caught all of it, not to judge, but to remember. It was the only place in the bathhouse that remembered her in return. Some nights, the mirror offered her glimpses she could not explain. A child running behind her, though no one was there. The hem of a robe that had burned long ago. Once even, a face she hadn't seen since she was still someone else. A face that smiled not cruelly, but with pity. She had stepped back then, but never stopped returning, because in that cracked glass there was no role, no name, no mask. Just Kajiro, just heat, cloth, and silence, and the knowledge that even the most forgotten corners still see. At the far end of the bathhouse, past the last stone basin and beyond the painted screen that no longer depicted anything clear, there was a door that no one else used. It was narrow, warped by humidity, and impossible to lock. Not because the mechanism was broken, but because the wood itself resisted closure. It didn't creak. It didn't groan. It simply opened, always gently, like someone drawing a breath so soft it could only be heard by those who knew how to listen. Kajiro had passed through it hundreds of times, perhaps thousands. And still, each night, she hesitated before placing her hand on its worn frame. The door was not hers. It belonged to the bathhouse. It had opened long before her, and it would remain long after. But it recognized her. That much she was sure of, for it never resisted her touch, never swelled in the rain or stuck in the summer heat. It simply yielded, like muscle surrendering to memory. On the nights when the fog rolled in thick from the river and the lanterns flickered for no reason at all, she sometimes wondered what would happen if the door refused to open. What part of herself would be denied? What would remain, waiting behind that wooden frame, locked in steam and silence? The thought sent a shiver down her back, not of fear, but of anticipation, because in that moment of doubt, the door always opened, as if to remind her that the bathhouse needed her, too. Beyond the door was the smallest room in the entire structure. No tubs, no shelves, just a stone floor, a narrow window, and a low table scarred by candle drips. This was where she prepared the soaking herbs, wrapped the cloths, counted the hours by the way mist curled around the moonlight. This was her sanctum, a space untouched by performance, request, or gaze. And yet, even here, she never felt alone. The air moved as if someone had just left, or was just about to arrive. She would sit there sometimes, long after her work was done, fingers tracing the grain of the table, forehead resting against the cool stone wall, listening, not for voices, but for breath, because there was always a breath, faint, rhythmic, like a pulse beneath the floor, the kind of breath that doesn't belong to a body anymore, but lingers, waiting, and that breath had begun to change. She noticed it first as a stain, small, almost apologetic, near the edge of the main bath's drain. At first glance, it could have been rust, a trace of iron from the old pipes. But when she leaned closer, cloth in hand, the scent corrected her. Not metal, blood, faint, dry, not fresh enough to alarm, but not old enough to ignore. Blood was not unusual in the bathhouse. It came in droplets, hidden in folds, disguised beneath rouge and powder. A cut from a comb, a cracked lip, the unspoken cycles of the women who were not allowed to speak of such things. But this blood was different, not smeared or accidental. It had formed a thread, delicate, almost deliberate, as if someone had unraveled herself slowly and left the proof coiled by the drain. She touched it with the back of her finger. It didn't smear. It clung. The cloth she used to clean, it turned warm in her hands, despite the water being cold. And when she looked again, the stain had not disappeared. It had moved slightly, closer to the edge, as if drawn to the place where all things vanish. She stood very still then, cloth dripping in her hand, her breath shallow. The bathhouse was quiet, too quiet. Even the pipes held their breath. That night, the steam refused to rise. The herbs she boiled did not release their scent. The towels felt heavier, as though soaked in something denser than water. And she could feel something watching, not with eyes, but with presence. A weight in the corners, a shift in temperature that made her spine ache. When she passed the mirror in the hallway, she did not stop. Because this time, she knew it would not be her reflection staring back. Later, when the floor was dry and her hands raw from scrubbing, she returned to the drain. The thread was gone, not absorbed, not washed away, gone, as if it had completed its purpose. And in its absence, something remained, a feeling, like someone had whispered her name without sound, a breath against the nape of her neck, familiar, intimate, and deeply, unexplainably wrong. There is a particular heaviness that comes from soaked fabric, not merely the weight of water, but the way it clings, reluctant to release its burden. That night, as Kajiro knelt beside the basin to wring the towels dry, she found them impossibly heavy, heavier than usual. Not soaked through, but dense, as if they had been holding something in suspension, something more than moisture. The first towel took both hands. The second left her wrists trembling. By the third, she paused, not out of fatigue, out of unease. She unrolled one cloth slowly across the floor, expecting the usual marks, soap residue, bits of hair, a smudge of rouge. But there was none of that. Just wetness. Deep, consistent, unnatural wetness, not the kind left by bodies, but by something waiting. The texture of the fabric was different too smooth in places, almost like silk, though she had only ever used coarse linen. She pressed her fingers into it and felt warmth that did not belong to the room, as if someone had just pressed their cheek against that same spot. The smell was the next betrayal. Towels never smelled clean, and that was expected. But this one had no smell at all. No camphor, no mildew, not even the faint scent of skin. It was absence, pure and blank. And in that absence, Kajiro felt her own scent dissolve, as if the towel was erasing more than sweat, more than history, as if it had begun to erase her. She let the fabric fall to the floor with a slap louder than it should have been, the echo clinging to the walls longer than necessary. The other towels were worse. Each one altered in some small but undeniable way. A fold that resisted opening. A corner that appeared torn though she had mended it yesterday. One had something stitched into it, a small cross, sewn in crimson thread so fine she hadn't noticed at first. She didn't touch it. Not yet. Instead, she sat back on her heels and stared at the pile before her, as one might stare at a body found in the road, familiar in form, but estranged by circumstance. That night, she did not fold them. She left them spread across the floor, open to the air, as if hoping the bathhouse would breathe through them and undo whatever had begun. But sleep did not come. Even in her own corner room, the scentless weight of the towels lingered on her fingers. And in the middle of the night, she woke with a damp corner of cloth pressed gently against her neck, though she slept alone, and the door had remained locked. She had never tasted the steam before. Not truly, not consciously. But on that night, when she entered the main chamber to relight the bath's flame, the air clung to her tongue. Not moisture, not salt, something else. Something metallic and vaguely sweet, like syrup left too long in a copper pan. She paused beneath the eaves, the fire flickering uncertainly beside her, and let her breath move slowly through her mouth, just to be sure. The taste remained. Sharp, delicate, intimate. It was then that she realized the steam was no longer rising from the bath. It was coming from the walls, from the stone floor, from the cracks in the wood where water had seeped centuries ago and now returned, like memory, uninvited. She approached the tub and placed her hand above its surface. No heat. The water was tepid, still. Yet the air shimmered, thick with breath that wasn't hers. She could feel it along her spine, like fingers that hovered but never touched. She moved slowly, as if entering a dream she wasn't sure was hers. Her steps made no sound. Even the damp planks refused to creak. And when she reached the edge of the bath, she did not lean over. She knelt, softly, reverently. The surface of the water was smooth, opaque, not from soap or herbs, but from something deeper, like the layer of memory that settles over grief when it cools. She reached toward it, not to touch, just to see if it would react. It did. A ripple. Small, gentle, but deliberate, not from her breath, not from movement. From within, as if something had shifted just beneath the surface. She froze, hand suspended, and waited. Another ripple, this one wider, then stillness. But the taste in her mouth had grown stronger, coating her teeth like the aftershock of a secret spoken too closely. She swallowed. It remained. The steam had entered her. Later, in her private room, she tried to purge the taste, rinsing with sake, chewing salted plum, biting her own tongue until the tang of blood replaced it. Nothing worked. And when she exhaled against her palm, the scent she knew so well, her scent, her warmth, was gone, replaced by something older, darker, and not entirely hers. The mirror had always responded to her in delay, a half-second after she moved, a flutter of resistance, like a ghost deciding whether or not to mimic. But tonight, it was waiting, already alive when she entered the corridor, already pulsing with something like breath. She paused at the threshold, one foot still in shadow, and watched as the image of herself shifted, not in form, but in stillness. The mirror had anticipated her. She stepped forward slowly, her bare feet silent on the tatami, and stood before the warped glass. What stared back wasn't quite wrong, but it wasn't quite her. The robe was correct, the braid, the tilt of the head, but the eyes, they weren't tired, they weren't damp, they were fixed, as if she had slept deeply and woken into something far too awake. And worse still, the reflection blinked before she did, just once, barely noticeable, but enough. She raised her hand. The mirrored version followed. No hesitation, no drag. But when she let it fall, the reflection held for a breath too long, as though reluctant to let her go. She felt her heartbeat rise, not in fear, but in recognition, not of the image, but of herself. A self she had buried beneath cloth, labor, steam. A self that did not smell of herbs or lye, but of dirt and birthwater and blood. The woman before her had not cleaned anything. She had gathered, kept, accumulated, and behind that image, for the first time, the room within the mirror extended too far. She could see the corridor reflected in angles that didn't exist in the real space. Another door behind her. A bowl she had never placed. A low table with a single thread of crimson tied to its leg. She turned to look, and there was nothing. Only the old wall, the warped floor. But the mirror insisted. It showed her what could not be, or what had always been, just not in this world. She did not touch the glass. She bowed to it, slowly, her spine curving as it did when she greeted the elders long ago, before this city, before this name. And when she rose, the reflection smiled, softly, not menacing, but full. And in that smile, Kajiro felt something settle inside her, a warmth that did not belong to now, or to here, but to some other version of herself that had never stopped waiting to be remembered. The door near the herbs cabinet had always led to the storeroom, a narrow, mold-scented corridor filled with baskets of rice chaff, bundles of lavender, dried yuzu skins. But that night, when she pushed it open, the air shifted. There was no resistance, no smell, no familiarity, only darkness, absolute and soft, like velvet drawn over the eyes. She didn't step back. She didn't hesitate. Her hand stayed on the frame, but her body leaned in, just enough for the silence to pull at her. The floor was different. Smooth, cold, not wood, Stone? No, older. Packed earth, worn flat by centuries of steps she had never taken. She took one barefoot step into the dark, then another. The warmth of the bathhouse faded behind her, and as her eyes adjusted, she realized this was not a room. It was a passage, narrow, humid, with walls that exhaled faintly, like lungs that had forgotten how to rest. The light came not from lanterns, but from something deeper, a glow embedded in the clay, like gold dissolved in sweat. On either side, the walls held impressions, not carvings, not paintings, but pressings of hands, foreheads, mouths, as if generations had leaned here, sobbed here, kissed here. Kajiro ran her fingers along the grooves and felt a pulse. Real, subtle, a heartbeat stored in earth, a rhythm she recognized, though she did not know from where. Further in, the passage widened into a room, circular, domed, and at its center, a pool, not wide, not grand, just deep, lined with stone too smooth to be natural. Water still to the point of reflection, though there was no ceiling to reflect. She approached. The air thickened around her, not choking, but intimate, like entering a memory not hers. The surface of the pool held no scent, no warmth, only an invitation. She knelt, not from ritual, but from instinct, and there, hovering just above the water, she saw it, a thread, crimson, thin as breath, unbroken, floating, not drifting. One end coiled in the pool's center, the other she followed with her eyes. It disappeared beneath her robe, through the folds, toward her chest. She did not reach to pull it. She only breathed, and felt it pulse once, not pain, not fear, but recognition, as if something inside her had finally been named. When Kajiro stepped back from the pool, the ground beneath her felt warm, not in patches, but as a whole, like the bathhouse itself had a body, a pulse, a temperature that responded to her presence. She moved carefully, feeling with her soles, and noticed the faintest give beneath the packed earth, as though it had once been something softer, flesh perhaps, or breath hardened into ground. Each step left an impression that didn't rise again. She returned through the passage with slow, reverent steps, trailing the invisible thread that still hummed in her chest. But as she passed the familiar corridor, where once the scent of yuzu and ash lingered, the walls exhaled against her skin. She paused, turned her face toward the paneling, and it was then she noticed the grain of the wood was no longer wood. It was skin, dry patterned, etched with lines too organic to be carpentry. She touched it with the back of her fingers. It was warm, and it responded. The panel beneath her palm quivered, not violently, not in rejection, but in awareness, as if the bathhouse itself had just recognized her, not as servant, not as ghost, but as something of its own making. She took a breath, deeper than usual, and felt her ribs expand into a silence that was no longer empty. The scent in the air changed, not herbal, Not sweet, something older, wet parchment, heated ink, a scroll unrolling in the dark, whispering names she hadn't spoken in years. She looked down. The floor had begun to ripple, not dramatically, not like waves, but like breath moving beneath a thin blanket. It curved with her, responded to her stillness, and where she stepped, it remembered her weight. Her feet left no wet prints. Instead, pale outlines remained, glowing faintly, not with light, but with attention. She was being watched, not by eyes, by presence. The bathhouse was no longer a space. It was a body, and she was no longer within it. She was part of it. Later, back in her corner room, she washed her hands in silence. But the water recoiled. It did not cool her. It did not cleanse. It slid off her skin without grip, as if she no longer belonged to the same substance, as if the bathhouse had claimed her, not as a visitor, but as an organ that had forgotten its purpose, now awakened. It began as a sound, not a moan, not a voice, but a slow, deliberate exhale from behind the wall near the steam chamber. Kajiro had just begun to gather the cloths for rinsing when the breath reached her ear, unmistakably close. She turned, expecting wind, but the window was closed. The candle remained steady, and the air dense, unmoving, held the breath like a secret just released. She approached the wall. It was one of the oldest in the house, patched with layers of plaster, paper, soot. A place no one ever touched. But tonight, it pulsed. Barely perceptible, a shallow rise and fall, as if someone were pressing their face to the other side, breathing through the paper. She knelt, placed her palm flat against it. The surface was dry, but warm, breathing, waiting. And then she heard it, a whisper, not words, a sound shaped like a name, though not spoken aloud. Not hers, but close. A name she might have carried once, before Kajiro, before the towel and basin and thread. Her breath caught in her throat. She leaned in, ear nearly pressed to the wall, and there, the unmistakable softness of lips. Moving, not pressing, just forming. Shapes of sound too delicate for comprehension, but present, real, whispering into her, through the wood. Her chest tightened, not in fear, but in resonance, like a drum being struck far beneath the surface of a lake. She pulled back, slowly, and stared at the wall. Something shifted in the grain, a curve, a shadow, the brief illusion of a mouth formed not of plaster but of absence. A kiss-shaped void, open, expectant, still. She reached toward it, fingertips hovering just short of touch, and the breath came again, this time in rhythm with her own. She stayed there for a long while, matching her inhale to its exhale, becoming, for a moment, a shared lung, a shared breath, a shared space. And in that stillness, the house no longer felt like a structure. It felt like memory made of flesh, like grief with walls, like something that had been waiting not for her hands, not for her labor, but for her breath. Her name, Her recognition. When she finally stood, the mouth was gone. The wall was flat, cool, unremarkable. But in her throat remained the taste of that breath, sweet, distant, like steam drawn through silk, and the sense that she had been spoken to by something that did not use language, but remembered everything she had forgotten. In the back alcove where the firewood was kept dry, a place dimly lit and seldom visited, there was a small candle in a clay holder, shaped like a lotus with its petals slightly curled. No one lit it. No one remembered who had placed it there. And yet, each night for the past 3 nights, Kajiro found it burning. Always softly, never flickering. The flame seemed not to dance, but to hold still, as if it too were listening. She had tried to extinguish it once, out of instinct, not malice. She cupped her hands around the warmth, drew in her breath, and blew gently. The flame bent, bowed, seemed to flicker in agreement. But it did not die. Instead, it pulled inward for a moment, shrinking, shivering, and then re-emerged. Taller, steadier, not defiant, but deliberate, as though it had simply chosen not to leave. She tried again, a sharper breath, a hand pressed close. Still, the flame remained. Its light did not cast shadows, only softened the dark around it, blurring the edges of crates and bamboo baskets into shapes that felt less like objects and more like memories. The scent was faint, beeswax, with a hint of something fermented, like old sake left too long beside a shrine. And as she stood over it, a strange sensation bloomed in her throat, a pressure. Not pain, not emotion, something else, like a word forming without sound. That night, instead of fighting the flame, she sat beside it, knees tucked beneath her, palms resting on the stone floor. She stared at the small lotus shape, the way the light licked each petal, never burning, only warming. She remembered then a ritual from her childhood, a funeral where no one wept aloud. Only candles were lit, one for each memory the body had refused to confess, and the flame that lingered longest was said to carry the secret the soul feared most. The candle before her did not flicker. It pulsed, a steady rhythm, matching her breath, matching the warmth in her palms. And in its quiet glow, she felt her skin loosen, not peel, not burn, just yield, as if something beneath it had grown restless. Already, when she finally stood, the room around her felt softer, like a wound that had stopped bleeding, like a mouth that had chosen silence not out of fear, but reverence. By morning, the main tub was always emptied. That was the rule. Whether by hand or by hidden pipe, the water was drawn down into the earth before first light. But when Kajiro entered the chamber before sunrise, towel still damp from sleep, the bath was full. Not overflowing, not warm, just full, quietly, deeply, as if it had been filled not with water, but with time. She approached slowly, unsure whether she was witnessing a mistake or an intention. The surface did not ripple. The steam was faint, but real. and the scent in the air was unlike any herb she had prepared, not floral, not bitter. A soft salinity, like the sea pressed into silk, like tears left too long on skin. She knelt by the edge and reached a hand forward, not to touch but to offer, and the water rose to meet her. Not a wave, not a splash, just a soft curve, as if the tub itself exhaled. Her fingers hovered inches above the surface, and yet moisture gathered on her skin. The water knew her, responded to her, and beneath its stillness something moved, not a fish, not a shadow, but a presence. She could feel it tracking her breath, a slow ascent, a coiling attention, the kind of gaze that presses behind the eyes, even when closed. She drew back slowly, but the sensation clung to her, not wetness, but recognition, as if her presence had awakened something that had been sleeping in the bath for far too long. A memory, maybe, or a body not fully dissolved. She circled the tub, eyes scanning for cracks, for leaks, for any logical source. But there was none. The water had not come from outside. It had come from within, as though the bath had remembered how to refill itself. Later, when she drained it, because she had to, the water resisted. Not violently, not visibly, but with weight. The plug came loose with difficulty, and even then, the flow was sluggish, as if every drop passed through something reluctant, something grieving. And when the last swirl vanished into the dark, Kajiro remained kneeling, hands still hovering, palm warm with the ghost of touch. The tub, now empty, held more silence than before. Not absence, but fullness. A belly that had offered something vital. And she, without quite knowing why, bowed deeply to it, forehead to the tile, not as ritual, not as superstition, but as thanks, for being allowed to witness something that should not have been possible, and for being seen, perhaps, in return. It had been days since she first noticed the crimson thread, faint, warm, silent, pulsing gently beneath her skin like a secret too patient to rush. But that morning, as she knelt to wipe condensation from the base of the wooden columns, she felt it tug. Not sharply, not like a string caught on something external, but from within. A soft tension, deep in her chest, pulling not toward the door or corridor, but downward, inward, as though the thread had remembered a direction she had forgotten. She paused, cloth suspended mid-motion, and placed a hand over her sternum. The sensation was unmistakable, a slow rhythmic pull, like breath being drawn through her bones. She stood slowly, unsure if her balance would hold. It did, but something else shifted, the air. It had thickened, not with steam, but with intention. The bathhouse was no longer passive. It was watching, not idly, but expectantly. Kajiro followed the pull. Not with urgency, with surrender. Her steps were slow, deliberate, guided not by sight or logic, but by rhythm, a deep, cellular recognition. The corridor narrowed around her. The light bent subtly. Doors she knew were there, weren't. Others, once sealed shut, now opened with a breath. The path curved in ways that defied the blueprint of the house she had memorized over years. And yet, she never felt lost, only returned. She arrived in a room she didn't recognize, and yet felt deeply known by. The walls were made of layered cloth, damp and translucent, stitched with red thread that matched the one pulsing in her chest. On the floor, a basin of dark water shimmered with no visible light source. Floating within it, a single piece of linen folded tightly, marked with what looked like her name, or a name she had once been called, long before this life, long before names became armor. She stepped forward, and the thread within her pulled tight. For a moment, she could not breathe, not from fear, but from the overwhelming sensation of alignment, as if something she had carried for lifetimes had finally found its mirror. And in that moment, she understood. She was not being guided. She was being remembered. By the house, by the thread, by the fabric of whatever lived here, in the steam, in the silence, in the body of water and wall and woman. She reached for the cloth, and the cloth reached back. The basin's water did not move, not when she breathed upon it, not when the folds of her robe grazed its edge. It was as if the surface had hardened, not into ice, but into resolve. A mirror too still to reflect, a silence too full to echo. She crouched before it, the red thread in her chest now humming steadily, no longer pulling, only vibrating, like a string drawn taut across a sacred instrument. She extended one hand, slowly, toward the cloth. The water did not react. There was no ripple, no shimmer. Her fingertips hovered just above the surface and stopped. Not by choice, by refusal. Something in the water held her back. Not physically, not violently, but with a presence so dense, so immovable, that her skin could not pass through. It was not resistance. It was sovereignty. Kajiro exhaled, not in frustration, in reverence. This was not water meant to be touched. This was memory solidified. It had chosen its shape, and she, though bound to it by thread, by scent, by breath, was not yet ready. She withdrew her hand, bowed her head low, and listened. Not for sound, for temperature, for rhythm, for invitation. The kind of invitation that is felt not as welcome, but as surrender. The room around her pulsed in silence. The cloth in the basin remained still, but something had shifted. The walls, once merely damp, now wept slowly. Drops slid down the stitched fabric like tears held too long. She tilted her head and noticed, where the drops touched the ground, they did not disappear. They gathered, slowly, forming small round pools, mirrors within mirrors, each reflecting not her face, but something beneath her skin. She stood then, slowly, and walked among the droplets. Each one pulsed faintly, as if matching her heartbeat. The air was heavy, but it did not choke. It embraced, pressed against her limbs like fabric soaked in meaning. And when she looked again at the basin, the cloth was gone, vanished, or perhaps absorbed into water, into memory, into her. She did not panic. She did not weep. She simply turned, thread pulsing gently within her, and left the room. Behind her, the cloth walls shimmered once, like breath on glass, and the surface of the basin, though untouched, cracked open in silence. There was no path leading back, no footsteps to follow, no corridor she recognized. The bathhouse, or whatever it now was, had changed its shape around her. It did not trap. It enfolded, as if she had slipped into the fold of a robe and become part of its weave. The walls breathed with her. The floor warmed beneath her soles as she moved without deciding. She was no longer choosing direction. She was following rhythm. Then came the voice, not loud, not even audible, but undeniably present. It moved not through the air, but through her ribs, her throat, her skin. A vibration, a phrase without words, formed not in syllables but in breath. It entered her through her bones, as if her skeleton itself had become an ear. And what it said was not instruction, not warning, but recognition. A name, hers. Not the one she used, not Kajiro, but the original one, the one before time. Her knees buckled, but she did not fall. The walls steadied her, not with arms, but with softness, a curving of space, like a room offering its lap. She placed her hands on the floor and exhaled slowly, letting the name echo through her. She did not speak it aloud. She couldn't, but she knew it, deeply, and in knowing, something inside her unfurled. Not a memory, a return. The steam around her thickened, but did not blind. Instead, it drew close, wrapping itself around her limbs, her shoulders, her scalp, not clinging but supporting. It lifted her hair from her neck, warmed the joints of her fingers. She felt opened, like a scroll unrolling to reveal a script only the body could read. She no longer needed to see. She no longer feared being seen. The voice was not outside. It was what her breath had always tried to say. And in that fullness, something let go. Not her, the house. A hush fell. Not the absence of sound, but its culmination. As if everything, the wood, the thread, the mirror, the bath, the cloth, the name, had exhaled finally at once. And in that exhale, the space beneath her feet turned to warmth. Not fire, not water, something between, something like origin. She reached the central chamber just as the first light of dawn stretched across the ceiling, not direct sunlight, but a distant glow, as if the sky itself had become translucent with sleep. The bath was filled again, not with water, not entirely. What now rested within it shimmered like liquid stone, dense still, but softly illuminated from within. And at its center, a shape, not a statue, not a figure, just a form, rounded, smooth, pulsing faintly. A stone, yes, but not inert. Alive in the way that roots are alive, in the way that memory is alive. She approached with bare feet, the floor beneath her cool and textured, whispering with tiny cracks that seemed to echo her breath. She knelt beside the tub without hesitation. This was not ritual anymore. This was memory re-entered. Her hands hovered above the surface. The water did not stir, but her skin did, small tremors along her forearms, like fine hairs rising in recognition. She had touched this stone before. Not in this life, perhaps, but in some before life. In dream, in death, in becoming. She lowered her hand slowly, allowing her fingers to meet the surface. This time, it let her through. No resistance, no ripple, just smoothness, like a pond that has been waiting all winter for one fingertip. The stone beneath greeted her touch with temperature, warm at first, then cool, then warm again. A rhythm, like a heart. And as she leaned closer, her forehead almost touching the surface, the stone shifted. Not visibly, but in sensation. Its weight changed inside her chest. The thread that had pulled at her heart unwound, slowly, and dipped into the water. She did not panic. She did not stop. Her body knew what to do. Her breath deepened. Her pulse softened. Her voice, which she had not used in days, stirred within her. She did not speak. She sang. Not with words, with tone, with breath shaped into sound that belonged not to language, but to origin. The steam around her vibrated. The stone vibrated. Her bones joined in. And for a long, breathless moment, Kajiro was not a woman. She was the water, the stone, the house, the name, the mouth in the wall, the thread in the basin, the weight in the towels, the breath of those who came before her, and those who would come after. When the sound ended, the light dimmed, not into darkness, but into peace. When she returned to her chamber, or rather when the house let her return, her robe was waiting, folded precisely as she had never managed to fold it herself. Not stiff, not ceremonial, soft, familiar, like the blanket of a childhood bed, still warm from someone who left just before dawn. It lay atop her futon with a precision that felt like care, not discipline, as though someone had known exactly how her shoulders curved when tired. She approached it slowly. Her steps were not heavy, but measured, as if the floor beneath her had become aware of sound again. The air had cooled. The mist had retreated. And all that remained was texture, the woven silence of cloth, the faint scent of steam caught in linen, the dust-soft hush of walls exhaling after a long night of listening. She sat beside the robe, fingers brushing its edge. It did not feel like something to be worn. It felt like something to be remembered. Kajiro ran her hands over its folds. Each crease aligned with her own body, the dip of the spine, the curve of the collarbone, the weight of the hem as it met her ankle. It had memorized her, or she had become it. She didn't put it on immediately. She placed it gently over her lap, feeling the slight weight settle over her knees like the breath of an old friend leaning close. She closed her eyes, not to sleep, to receive. A breeze entered the room, not through a window, but through the seams of the house itself. It smelled of plum bark, of hot stone, of wind off a distant bath. It lifted the hem of the robe slightly, not playfully, but as if asking, "Are you ready?" She opened her eyes and saw that the folds had changed. They now cradled something small, dark, and round, the thread. Not floating, not moving, resting, waiting. She took the thread in her hand. It no longer pulsed. It no longer tugged. It simply lay across her palm, warm, pliant, content. She pressed it gently against her chest, and without effort, it disappeared beneath her skin, not piercing, not burning, just entering, like breath, like memory, like sleep. She had always cleaned the corners last, the quiet edges where floor met wall, where light rarely touched, where spiders nested and dust settled like forgotten thoughts. It was the final ritual of her nightly cycle, cloth in hand, knees creaking softly, breath slowed to match the stillness of the space. But this time, when she reached the first corner with her rag, there was no dust, no cobweb, no sign of age, just smoothness, silence, a corner too clean to be real. She moved to the next. Same, not spotless, but absent, as though time itself had been swept away, not by her hand, by something else, something older. She felt a strange weight in her fingertips, not of fatigue, but of finality. Her body knew before her mind there would be no more cleaning after tonight, no more rinsing, no more folding. The house had begun to close its breath, to smooth its skin, to seal its pores in preparation for something soft and eternal. She sat in the center of the chamber, facing the four corners at once, a position only possible when one is no longer trying to do anything. She breathed. The walls breathed with her. From one corner, the scent of hot stone. From another, camellia oil. From a third, salt and lavender. And from the fourth, nothing. Pure, clean stillness, as though it had already forgotten her. She did not grieve. She did not cling. Her hands rested open on her thighs, palms warm, skin no longer marked by labor. She looked down at them and saw that the fine cuts, the calluses, the shadows beneath her nails had vanished. Not healed, dissolved. The hands before her were not the hands of a worker. They were the hands of someone who had never needed to hold anything. Above her, the ceiling darkened, not from dusk, but from closure. The final fold of the house tucking itself into stillness. She tilted her head back and watched as the beams, the thatch, the faint strings of spiderweb, all softened, blurred, faded. The house no longer needed its edges. It had held her long enough, and now it would let her go. Or perhaps it would follow her, thread by thread. There had always been a knot in the center of the floor, a flaw in the wood, barely visible, where the grain curled inward like a fingertip pressed into soft clay. Kajiro had wiped over it 1,000 times, never thinking, never pausing. But now, as she sat barefoot in the half-light, that knot shimmered faintly, as if it had been waiting for this stillness. The spiral was no longer flat. It turned, slowly, deeply, downward. She crawled toward it, not with urgency, but with reverence. Her knees pressed into the warm planks, her fingers grazing the smooth whirl. And as her palm rested fully over the spiral, a warmth rose through her hand, not from beneath the floor, but from within it. The spiral began to pulse, not quickly, like breath, like sleep just before dreaming. The wood softened beneath her skin. Her fingers sank into it slightly, as if touching fabric soaked in heat. She closed her eyes. The spiral was no longer a shape. It was a direction, a path without distance, a descent not into darkness, but into gentleness. She leaned forward, forehead touching the knot. The floor did not resist. It welcomed. The spiral turned once, twice, then stopped. And in that stillness she heard it, not sound, not voice, but memory uncoiling, the laughter of water as it rushes through stone, the hush of robes folded in the dark, the whisper of a name that had never needed to be spoken. The spiral was not a symbol. It was the map of her breath, of the house's breath, of every bath drawn, every cloth wrung, every drop of steam that had clung to her eyelashes in the silence before dawn. She did not move. She simply breathed. And beneath her, the spiral slowly disappeared, not fading but entering her, absorbed, remembered, until all that remained was a warmth in her chest, and a sense that the floor no longer held her. It carried her. When she opened her eyes, the house was gone, or rather it was still there, but without edges. The walls had become outlines, the beams, faint brushstrokes. The air no longer held weight, only warmth. She stood slowly, and the ground beneath her flexed like fabric stretched over a slow breath. There was no door, no ceiling, only mist, pale golden, tinged with the scent of wet stone and plum blossom. And she tasted it as she inhaled, tasted sleep, not as metaphor but as flavor. Her robe was lighter now, not from fabric, but from memory. It draped over her body like fog over water. Her limbs moved without resistance, as if the joints no longer bore weight, only motion. She walked, though there was no path, no need for direction. Each step she took was both stillness and transition, a ripple across a body no longer bound to one shape. Shapes began to gather in the mist. Not faces, not people, impressions, gestures, the scent of someone bathing long ago, the laughter of a child dipping their toes into warm water, the hush of lovers whose names had long been lost to time. All around her, echoes moved, not haunting but tender. She had never been alone in this house. And now, she was not leaving it. She was becoming it. The mist thickened, not into blindness, but into comfort. A blanket not placed over her, but within her. Her breath slowed. Her hands opened. She tilted her head back and let the last sensation rise. The weight of warm water over skin, the memory of silence, the pulse of steam climbing the spine like a lullaby. The bathhouse had exhaled her, or perhaps she had exhaled it. In the final moments, there were no visions, no revelations, only stillness. Stillness so complete it felt like softness, like rest, like the final breath drawn not in fear, but in return. There is a kind of silence that comes after everything has been said, but nothing has been spoken. A silence that is not empty, but saturated, with warmth, with memory, with presence that no longer needs a name. Kajiro no longer walked, no longer stood, no longer leaned. She rested, not in posture, in essence. The mist around her thickened, but her body did not resist. It welcomed. Her robe fell away, not onto the floor, but into the air, unraveling as steam. Strands of cloth dissolved like smoke pulled into dream. Her skin loosened, her outline softened, and where she had been, there remained warmth. A basin appeared, round, still, familiar. Its water was clear now. At the bottom, a single red thread floated, not tight, not frayed, just there, like a syllable unspoken, like a vow fulfilled. The bathhouse, or whatever it had become, breathed once more, not through pipes, or fire, or flame, but through memory, through every towel once folded, through every scent once exhaled, through every hand that had ever touched water with reverence. Outside, dawn did not rise. It unfolded, like cloth smoothed by invisible hands, like breath slowed by the weight of sleep. And in that slow unfurling, Kajiro remained, not as body, not as ghost, but as warmth that lingered in the corners, as silence in the steam, as stillness in the bath. She had never been alone. She had only been waiting. And now, finally, the house could rest, because the last breath was hers, and it had not left. It had stayed.